But I want to tell you another story about ideology that can show you both how blinding it can be and also how seductive for really smart, good people. Because this is not, willful blindness isn't a function of intelligence or even, I would argue, virtue. Just after the Second World War in Oxford, there was a very fascinating physician named Alice Stewart. Now, Alice was unusual, partly because she was female, she was divorced, she had 2 kids. And she was also unusual because she had a real passion for the new emerging field of epidemiology. And as a good, ambitious scientist, she knew that the way to make her name was to find a very hard problem and solve it. And what Alice chose as her problem was really intriguing, which was the rise of childhood cancers in post-war Britain. Alice couldn't get very much funding. She got a £1,000 grant. She did what all great female entrepreneurs do, which is she leveraged a huge network of people to help her. She, of course, was working on pieces of paper and carbon paper and brown envelopes, which she sent out to district nurses all over the country. And she completed what became ultimately the largest childhood cancer study in the United Kingdom ever to this day. And as the responses started to come back, the answer jumped out with statistical clarity of a kind epidemiologists mostly only dream of. By a rate of 3 to 1, the answer to the question, had the mother ever had an X-ray when pregnant, the answer was yes. That there was an absolute and extreme correlation between babies getting cancer and their mothers having been X-rayed during the pregnancy. And this was so clear statistically that Alice rushed into print. Everybody got very excited. There was discussion about the Nobel Prize. And one of the things Alice said was, we have to hurry up and study all the other childhood cancers, because obviously we're going to stop doing this, and then they're going to go away, and we won't be able to study them and understand everything about this anymore. Well, she didn't need really to have hurried, because it was 26 years before the practice of X-raying pregnant women was abandoned by the British medical establishment. And at this time, they reckon there was a child dying every week. Now, what was going on? How could the medical establishment, in the face of this data, not change its practices? What on earth was going on? Well, what was the explanation to this really shocking example of willful blindness? Is something called threshold theory, which was a prevalent theory at the time that maintained that up to a point, a threshold, everything's safe. And then you cross a point, and then it becomes dangerous. And what Alice was saying was that for pregnant mothers, or for fetuses, there was no level of radiation that was safe. None. Accepting Alice Stewart's findings would have meant abandoning threshold theory. Scientists love theories. I know, I'm married to a scientist. He does love his theory, sometimes I think more than his family. But, we all love these theories and ideas that make sense of our experience, they make sense of our information, and we're afraid to let them go, because then what do we have? Chaos. Now, 26 years after Alice published her results, Richard Doll did very quietly, in a very small article in The Lancet, retire threshold theory, but not before enormous damage had been done. Threshold theory was a kind of ideology. It was a prevailing theory, a way of seeing the world. We all have these. We all have ideologies that say governments are better, smaller, or the best way to measure value is through money, or there is a moral imperative to intervention. We all have these theories, and they often blind us to evidence that stares us in the face. So Milgram was an American psychologist who was very perplexed by how so many good people in Germany had done so many bad things during the war. And he set up an experiment in which volunteers were asked to do something highly unethical to please an authority, which in this case was only a scientist in a white coat. And in the experiment, the volunteer had to ask questions of an actor. He didn't know this was an actor, but an actor in the next studio. And any time the answers were wrong, the volunteer had to deliver an electric shock. Now, in fact, it wasn't a real shock, of course, but he didn't know that. The question was, this is a highly, highly unethical thing to do. Would anybody obey? There are a couple of really important things about Milgram's experiments, which people often seem to have forgotten. And one is that before he did the experiment, he asked very, very large numbers of people, what did they think would happen? How would they behave? And universally, everyone said, well, nobody's going to go in and give an innocent man an electric shock. The electric shocks were on a sliding scale, which meant with each successive wrong answer, the shock became more intense until it went to 450 volts, which is a lethal dose. Surely, everyone said, no one, as a volunteer in a scientific experiment, is going to kill a participant. When Milgram conducted the experiment, fully 65% of participants went all the way. This experiment has been repeated all over the world ever since. At no point has there been any meaningful statistical variation in that outcome. At the time that Milgram did it, lots of people were so shocked by the outcome, it was so counter to their expectation, that they tried to explain it away. In one instance, they said, well, somehow, subliminally, subconsciously, these volunteers must have known that this was an actor, that it wasn't really real. Maybe the actor wasn't a very good actor. So some other scientists replicated the experiment, only this time using a puppy dog, on the grounds that, puppy dogs can't act. And in this case, with the little fluffy dog, men and women alike went all the way, 100% of them. First of all, he pointed out this was not an experiment about aggression. It was not an experiment about violence. He said he didn't find aggression. He said there's no anger, vindictiveness, or hatred in those who shocked the victim. Men do become angry, they do act hatefully and explode in rage against others, but not here. Something far more dangerous is revealed. The capacity for man to abandon his humanity, indeed, the inevitability that he does so. The inevitability that he does so as he merges his unique personality into larger institutional structures. And he went on to say, although a person acting under authority performs actions that seem to violate standards of conscience, it would not be true to say he loses his moral sense. Instead, it acquires a radically different focus. His moral concern now shifts to a consideration of how well he is living up to the expectations that the authority has of him. In other words, instead of thinking about, am I doing the right thing, he's thinking about, am I doing the thing well enough? I can think of no better explanation for a lot of the hijinks at News Corporation. I write at length about the banking collapse in my book. And I think there's several instances, there's several aspects of willful blindness in that. One of them is, you have this incredibly attenuated food chain, so that, between the person buying the house and the bank selling, the slices of mortgages, there are so many layers of complexity that everyone pretty completely loses the plot. And everyone's only concerned for their piece of it. To me, this is part of the problem endemic in division of labor, which is everyone only looks at their piece. I don't know if there are any science fiction fans here, but in Isaac Asimov's Foundation trilogy, there's this rule that the robots aren't allowed to kill humans. And the way they find their way around it is they divide the action into so many tiny steps that no single one of them is bad, and no single one of them appears to be breaking the law. This is exactly what happened in the banking scandal, which is every piece that each individual handled was kind of okay, and nobody felt responsibility for what happened further down the line. So I think that's part of it. There's also this very important thing which is known as bystander behavior. And again, there are millions of experiments that bear this out. But the rule of bystander behavior is the more people who observe something going wrong, the less likely it is that any one of them will intervene. So if I'm walking down a street by myself and I see a little old lady fall over, I'm very likely to go and help her. If she falls over in a very busy street, the chances are no one will. The banks were very busy streets. Very busy streets. Plus, I think, you also had, and this bugs me to this day, you also had a large number of very young, ambitious people who were themselves personally loaded with debt. Now, when you have a young, ambitious workforce, and they all are themselves carrying gigantic mortgages, you have the most compliant workforce on earth. And you still do. And I have a young friend working in News Corporation to this day, and she's afraid to leave because the economic climate is so bad, and where will she get another job? So when you have a bad economic climate, and you have people with a lot of personal debt, and you also have a society that's highly polarized between winners and losers, the fear of joining the out group is so profound that people will do anything. Let me explain, first of all, how I think something like this happens. So there are two things going on here. One is I'm a good person, and the people I work with, because they're my colleagues, are good people. So therefore, the company I work for must be a good company, and they wouldn't ask me to do anything wrong. So what I'm being asked to do must be okay, and everybody's doing it. So I think it's a very rare individual who says, I'm a bad person and I'm going to do a bad thing. Very rare. Very rare. We all come up with a version of ourselves and the world in which we are good people. So that's part of what happens. And the other thing that happens, because the thing that's so striking about this scandal is the vast scale on which it happened, is I think this issue of conformity is exactly what's happening. I don't think anybody sees themselves making the wrong choice. They simply don't experience it. There's some other interesting fMRI studies where people have read stories about decision making. And what's so striking about that is that the individuals in the experiments don't notice the moral choice. They simply don't see the moment at which it occurs. So they're asked to do a little, just go and call John, and John's a private investigator, and if the private investigator says, can I hire one of my guys, he's really good with phones, well, yeah, I guess that's okay. It's all chopped into small steps. Nobody except maybe the person at the very end is doing it, and he's not responsible, so he doesn't feel it's his moral problem. And at no point does anybody feel, I am actively doing a bad thing. And it can happen on a big scale because everybody's only doing tiny parts of it. So what would have prevented it? Well, what would have prevented it would be leadership picking up a paper saying, this is really strange. How did we get this story? That's what would have prevented it. But I think you also have to understand that this takes place within an economic climate where newspapers' readership is falling, the competition for eyeballs and money is fiercer than ever, then there's a fierce race to the bottom, a fierce competitive environment in which everybody's trying to outscream everybody else. And I think part of what was going on, and you see this still, is a complete lack of faith that a good product will sell. So there is, and this comes straight from the top, and both Murdochs, Pa and Son, have been very, very explicit about this. Which is, as James Murdoch said, the only guarantor of independence is profit. And the only reason you British people want quality is because you're class snobs, and I'm going to give people what they want. And, in a very competitive marketplace, if you believe that giving people more and more scandalous news is what will sell papers, then that is what a competitive marketplace will deliver. So I think that's how it happens. What prevents it, what prevents the economic market conditions in which this happens, we'll have to wait and see. Because I think, personally, I think the newspaper industry has raced itself almost completely to the bottom now. And the question is whether that will happen with television and other media as well. We all think, money really makes people do terrible things. But I thought, well, not always. How does it work? What does money do to your brain, I thought. And as it turns out, this is a very rich area for experimentation. And there's a fantastic woman in Ohio named Kathleen Vose who's done a just enormous bunch of experiments on what happens when you introduce money into relationships. And in one instance, she had a whole bunch of students who were playing Monopoly, and after they'd finished playing Monopoly, and some had made a lot of money and some had made very little money. As they were leaving the room, she had a student cross the room carrying a box of pencils and drop them. The question was, who would help? And of course, it turned out that the people who helped were the people who'd made the least amount of money on Monopoly. There's a very, very famous experiment by Ganesi and Rustaccini done at an Israeli daycare center that you may be aware of, where when they tried to stop parents from being late, they introduced a fine. And what they discovered was that far from stopping parents being late, they became more late. Because now money had entered into the relationship, the social piece of it had vanished. And what this vast body of experiments shows is that there's a sort of binary thing going on here with money, which is that money blinds us to social relationships. That if money is in our mind, the social bonds are weakened. Now, when you think about that, it actually makes tons of sense. When you have immense amounts of money, you don't need people. You can buy childcare instead of asking your neighbors for help. You can go in your private jet, which means you don't have to talk to anybody. You can live in your little bubble of a limo instead of having to share a lift with somebody. Perhaps the most beautiful example I came across of this, sort of the bubble of money, is Richard Fuld, the chief executive of Lehman Brothers, who had choreographed a perfect commute for himself, which he did every day, which meant he left his home in Greenwich, Connecticut, got into his limo, was driven to a private landing strip, where he got into a helicopter, flew to Manhattan, got out of the helicopter into another limo, and the entrance of Lehman Brothers was timed so that he could walk through the door into the waiting elevator, straight up to his office, never having to see an employee. That's what money will do for you. And it's mad because people are allowed to remain so severely out of touch. And this is a problem of power. This is not a problem of bad people. It's to do with the structure of power and how we treat powerful people. And there's a terrible irony that the more powerful you become, the more removed you are. And it isn't helpful. It absolutely isn't helpful. Now, having said that, there are many, many fine chief executives who, with all that on offer, don't take it. They understand the risk that's implicit in it. But, that takes, A, it takes courage, and B, it takes insight. And hey, at first it's really fun. You know, so it takes a while to realize actually this is quite bad news. I mean, the other thing I would say, and you know, this is just kind of me on my private hobby horse for a second here, but I think one of the reasons I had that insight that this world was mad is because virtually every day at 6 o'clock I went home to my two very young children, and I had to deal with my husband. You know that you know, one of us would be home by 6, and 2.5 days a week it would be me, and 2.5 days a week it would be him. In other words, as much as it was really difficult, and I have to say it was really difficult, we were both fiercely committed to our both having careers and spending time with our family and not outsourcing our family. And that's, I mean, it's a tough thing to do, and there were days I would really have liked to have, you know, shipped my children off and had them delivered back to me when they were 18. There are days I still wish that, actually. But it does really keep you grounded. And, you know, and there's this thing that Max Bazerman at Harvard Business School talks about, which is, you know, the dinner table test or the newspaper test, which is, you know, if you were going to go home tonight and talk to your family and your kids about what you've done today, would it be okay? There's a lot that, you know, dinner tables are very grounding places. And I think, you know, this notion we have that, you know, if you want to be really powerful, what you have to do is just work all the hours of the day and night and, you know, have a wife, have nannies, have all that stuff out there looking after your family. You know, I don't think it's great for the kids, but actually I think it's really bad for the grown-ups.